The antiseptic smell of the recovery room still clung to my hospital gown as I stared at the revised will document spread across my bedside table. My hands, still shaky from the anesthesia, gripped the pen that would change everything. 72 hours had passed since my emergency heart surgery, and in those 3 days, I had learned more about my family's true nature than I had in my entire 68 years of life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The silence in room 314 was deafening. No flowers adorned the windowsill, no get-well cards lined the walls, no worried family members occupied the uncomfortable visitor chairs. Just me, Margaret Rose Sullivan, lying in a hospital bed, realizing that the people I had spent my lifetime loving and providing for had abandoned me when I needed them most. The cardiac surgeon had warned me that this procedure would be life-changing, but he had no idea how prophetic those words would become. As I signed my name with deliberate strokes across the bottom of each page, I thought about the phone calls that had gone unanswered, the excuses that had been made, and the empty promises that had been broken. My children, whom I had raised with every ounce of love and sacrifice I could muster, had collectively decided that my medical emergency was an inconvenience to their busy lives. The woman who had worked 3 jobs to put them through college, who had sold her cherished antique jewelry to help with their down payments, who had babysat their children every weekend for years, was now completely alone in her hour of greatest need. 3 months before that fateful surgery, I had been living what I believed was a blessed life. My name is Margaret Rose Sullivan, though everyone has always called me Maggie. At 68, I considered myself one of the fortunate ones. After 45 years of working as a registered nurse at Riverside General Hospital, I had built a comfortable retirement fund that had grown to just over $2 million through careful investments and frugal living. My modest 2-story house in Maple Grove had been paid off for 15 years, and I owned a small cabin on Crystal Lake that had been in my family for generations. More importantly than my financial security, I had what I thought was a close-knit family. My 3 children, Thomas, Jennifer, and Amy, all lived within 30 miles of me. Thomas, my eldest at 45, worked as a manager at an automotive dealership and lived in the prestigious Willowbrook subdivision with his wife Patricia and their twin boys Michael and Matthew. Jennifer, my middle child at 42, had followed in my footsteps and become a nurse practitioner, though she worked at the competing hospital across town. She lived in a beautiful colonial home with her husband Derek and their daughter Sophie. Amy, my youngest at 39, had married her college sweetheart and moved to the next town over, where she taught high school English and raised her son Jacob with her husband Ryan. For years, our family had maintained what I believed were strong traditions. Every Sunday, we gathered at my house for dinner. I would spend Saturday preparing the meal, setting the dining room table with my grandmother's china, and making sure everyone's favorite dishes were included. Thomas loved my pot roast with carrots and potatoes. Jennifer always requested my famous apple pie. Amy couldn't get enough of my homemade dinner rolls. The grandchildren would run through my backyard, playing on the swing set I had installed specifically for their visits, while the adults sat on my wraparound porch, discussing their weeks and planning upcoming family events. Holiday celebrations were elaborate affairs that I orchestrated with military precision. Christmas morning meant everyone gathered in my living room, where I had spent weeks decorating every surface with lights, garland, and the ornament collection I had been building for decades. Easter brought egg hunts in my garden, with baskets I filled personally for each grandchild. Thanksgiving meant a table that groaned under the weight of turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, and all the side dishes that had been family favorites for generations. I had always been the family organizer, the one who remembered birthdays and anniversaries, who coordinated schedules and planned surprises. When Thomas and Patricia celebrated their 15th wedding anniversary, I threw them a party for 60 people in my backyard, complete with a catered dinner and a slideshow of their relationship milestones. When Jennifer graduated with her master's degree, I organized a celebration dinner at the finest restaurant in town. When Amy's son Jacob made the honor roll, I was the one who suggested we all go to his favorite theme park to celebrate. My role in the family extended far beyond emotional support. Over the years, I had provided substantial financial assistance to all three of my children. When Thomas wanted to buy his house in Willowbrook but came up short on the down payment, I quietly transferred $30,000 to his account. When Jennifer and Derek faced unexpected medical bills after Sophie's emergency appendectomy, I covered the entire amount without hesitation. When Amy and Ryan needed a new car after their old one died, I co-signed the loan and made several payments when they struggled to keep up. I had helped pay for soccer camps and piano lessons, college application fees, and graduation parties. When the grandchildren needed school clothes or wanted to participate in expensive extracurricular activities, Grandma Maggie was always there with her checkbook. I estimated that over the past 20 years, I had contributed nearly $200,000 to my children's various needs and wants, and I had never once asked for repayment or even acknowledgement of the sacrifice. My generosity wasn't limited to money. I had been the family's unofficial childcare provider for years. Every Friday night, at least one grandchild would sleep over at my house, where I would make pancakes for breakfast and take them to the park or the children's museum. During school breaks, I became a full-time babysitter, picking up children from school, helping with homework, and entertaining them until their parents finished work. When Jennifer went through her difficult divorce from her first husband, I kept Sophie for 3 months while Jennifer got back on her feet emotionally and financially. I prided myself on being the kind of mother and grandmother who never said no, who never made my children feel guilty for asking for help, who celebrated their successes and comforted them through their failures. When Thomas lost his first job, I listened to him cry over coffee in my kitchen and helped him rewrite his resume. When Jennifer struggled with postpartum depression, I drove her to therapy appointments and stayed with the baby so she could rest. When Amy questioned her career choice, I spent hours discussing her options and assured her that whatever she decided would have my full support. My social life revolved entirely around my family. While other women my age joined book clubs or traveled with friends, I spent my time and energy making sure my children and grandchildren felt loved and supported. I had turned down invitations to senior center activities, declined opportunities to volunteer with organizations I cared about, and avoided developing friendships that might take time away from my family obligations. My children were my hobby, my passion, my entire world. The warning signs that something was shifting in our family dynamic were subtle at first, so gradual that I convinced myself I was imagining problems where none existed. It started with small changes that I rationalized away, telling myself that my children were simply getting busier with their own lives and responsibilities. The Sunday dinners began to feel different sometime in early spring. Thomas started arriving later, claiming that the boys had soccer practice that ran over time. Jennifer would spend most of the meal checking.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Her phone, explaining that the hospital might call with urgent patient concerns. Amy seemed distracted and tired, often asking me to repeat things I had said and contributing little to our conversations. The easy laughter that had once filled my dining room became sporadic, replaced by polite conversation and awkward silences. More concerning was the gradual reduction in their requests for help. For years, I had been the first person any of my children called when they faced a problem or needed assistance. Suddenly, they seemed to be handling everything independently. When I offered to babysit, they claimed they had already made other arrangements. When I suggested contributing to the grandchildren's activities, they assured me they had everything covered. When I asked about their work stress or relationship challenges, they gave me brief, superficial responses that felt like polite dismissals. The physical affection that had always been natural in our family began to feel forced and obligatory. Hugs became quick, perfunctory gestures instead of the warm embraces I was used to. Kisses hello and goodbye felt rushed, like items being checked off a to-do list. Even the grandchildren seemed less enthusiastic about their visits, more interested in their electronic devices than in spending time with Grandma Maggie. I started noticing that my children were making major decisions without consulting me, or even informing me until after the fact. Thomas and Patricia had hired a landscaping company to renovate their backyard without mentioning their plans, despite the fact that I had been helping them with yard work for years. Jennifer enrolled Sophie in an expensive summer camp without discussing it with me, even though I had been her primary childcare provider during previous summer breaks. Amy and Ryan bought a new house and had been looking for months before they casually mentioned it during one Sunday dinner. The most painful change was in how they responded to my attempts to maintain our family traditions. When I suggested planning our annual summer vacation to the lake cabin, they all claimed their schedules were too complicated to coordinate. When I offered to organize Jennifer's birthday party, she told me she preferred to keep the celebration small and family only, which apparently no longer included me in the planning process. When I mentioned starting our Christmas shopping together, a tradition we had maintained for 20 years, Amy said she was doing all her shopping online this year. I found myself working harder and harder to maintain connections that had once felt effortless. I would call my children more frequently, only to reach voicemail more often than not. I would suggest activities and outings, only to be told they were unavailable or uninterested. I would offer help with projects or problems, only to be assured that everything was under control. The woman who had once been central to every family decision was slowly being moved to the periphery of her own children's lives. During one particularly difficult evening in late May, I sat in my living room surrounded by photo albums that chronicled decades of family memories. I studied pictures from birthday parties where I had spent days planning and decorating, Christmas mornings where I had stayed up all night wrapping presents, family vacations where I had organized every detail and paid for most expenses. The smiling faces in those photographs looked genuinely happy, authentically grateful, sincerely loving. I couldn't understand when or why those feelings had changed. I called my sister Rose, who lived in Florida, needing someone to validate my concerns or convince me I was being paranoid. Rose had always been brutally honest, sometimes to the point of being harsh, but I trusted her judgment completely. "They're pulling away from you, Maggie," she said after listening to my concerns for nearly an hour. "I've been watching it happen for months during our phone calls. You've made yourself so available, so accommodating that they've started taking you for granted. They expect you to always be there, so they've stopped appreciating that you are." Her words stung because they rang true. I had indeed made myself indispensable to my children's lives, handling their problems and supporting their needs so consistently that my presence had become expected rather than appreciated. But I had done it out of love, out of a desire to be needed and valued by the people I cared about most. What should I do? I asked Rose, feeling lost and confused about how to repair relationships that seemed to be deteriorating despite my best efforts. "Stop trying so hard," she advised. "Let them come to you for a while. See if they miss what you've been providing, or if they're relieved not to have to maintain the relationship." Following Rose's advice proved to be one of the most difficult things I had ever done. Instead of calling my children multiple times each week, I waited for them to contact me. Instead of organizing family gatherings, I waited to be invited to theirs. Instead of offering help and assistance, I waited to be asked. The results were devastating and enlightening in equal measure. Thomas didn't call for 3 weeks. When he finally contacted me, it was to ask if I could babysit the twins for a weekend while he and Patricia attended a wedding in Chicago. There was no inquiry about my health or well-being, no attempt at casual conversation, just a direct request for a favor. When I asked about the wedding, he gave me minimal details and seemed impatient to end the conversation. Jennifer went even longer without reaching out. Nearly a month passed before she called, and then only because she needed someone to pick up Sophie from school when a patient emergency kept her at the hospital past closing time. During the brief call, she sounded stressed and distracted, thanking me perfunctorily for the help but showing no interest in connecting beyond the immediate need. Amy's silence stretched for 6 weeks. When she finally contacted me, it was through a text message asking if I could contribute money toward Jacob's summer baseball league fees. There was no phone call, no personal conversation, just a financial request delivered through the most impersonal medium possible. The pattern became clear and heartbreaking. My children contacted me only when they needed something from me, whether it was childcare, money, or some other form of assistance. There were no calls just to chat, no invitations to spend time together, no expressions of interest in my life or well-being. I had become a resource to be accessed when convenient, rather than a beloved family member to be cherished and included. The realization that I was being used rather than loved was devastating. But it was also clarifying. For the first time in years, I began to consider what I wanted from my relationships with my children, rather than focusing exclusively on what I could do for them. I started paying attention to how one-sided our interactions had become, how much I gave compared to how much I received, how often I accommodated their needs while my own went unnoticed and unmet. I decided to test the strength of our family bonds by stepping back further from my role as the family organizer and provider. I stopped calling entirely, waiting to see if any of my children would reach out simply because they missed talking to me. I stopped organizing Sunday dinners, curious to see if anyone would suggest maintaining the tradition we had shared for decades. I stopped offering financial assistance or childcare, wanting to know if my children valued my presence when it wasn't accompanied by tangible benefits. The results of my experiment were more painful than I had anticipated. 2 months passed without a single call that wasn't related to a specific request for help. No one suggested continuing our Sunday dinner tradition. No one invited me to their homes for a meal or family activity. No one asked why I seemed less available or expressed concern about my well-being. It was as if I had become invisible to the people I loved most in the world. During this period of deliberate distance, I began to recognize how much of my identity had been tied to my role as a self-sacrificing mother and grandmother. Without my children's constant needs to fulfill, I found myself with time and energy I hadn't experienced in decades. I started reading books for pleasure, instead of reading only parenting articles and family-oriented magazines. I began taking walks in the evening instead of spending every free moment cooking and cleaning for family gatherings. I rediscovered interests and hobbies that I had abandoned years ago in favor of focusing on my children's activities and achievements. The physical symptoms of stress that I had been experiencing for months began to subside. My sleep improved when I stopped lying awake, worrying about my children's problems and planning ways to help them. My appetite returned when I stopped feeling constantly anxious about family dynamics. My blood pressure, which had been elevated during my last several doctor visits, returned to normal ranges when I stopped carrying the emotional burden of everyone else's happiness. One evening in early August, while I was tending to my flower garden, something I had neglected for years because I was always too busy with family obligations, I experienced a moment of startling clarity. I realized that I had been so focused on being needed that I had forgotten to consider whether my efforts were actually appreciated. I had been giving not because my children asked for help, but because I needed to feel important and valued. My generosity had become a form of emotional manipulation, a way of ensuring that my children remained dependent on me and therefore connected to me. The recognition that my motives had been, at least partially selfish, was humbling and liberating. It freed me from the obligation to continue patterns that were clearly not working for anyone involved. It also helped me understand that my children's growing distance might have been a healthy response to my increasing emotional demands and expectations. That night, I sat down with a cup of tea and began making a list of all the ways I wanted to change my life. I wanted to develop friendships with people my own age who shared my interests. I wanted to travel to places I had always dreamed of visiting but had never explored because I was too busy managing family obligations. I wanted to volunteer for causes I cared about, using my nursing skills and life experience to help people who truly needed and appreciated assistance. I wanted to rediscover who Margaret Rose Sullivan was outside of her roles as mother and grandmother. For the first time in decades, I began making plans that were entirely focused on my own happiness and fulfillment. I researched volunteer opportunities at the local animal shelter and the literacy center downtown. I looked into senior travel groups that organized trips to destinations I had always wanted to see. I considered taking art classes at the community college, something I had dreamed about doing since retirement but had never pursued because I was too busy with family responsibilities. The more I planned for a life that centered on my own interests and goals, the more I realized how much of myself I had sacrificed in the name of family devotion. I had given up friendships, hobbies, travel opportunities, and personal growth experiences because I believed that being a good mother meant making my children the exclusive focus of my time and attention. I had confused love with sacrifice, support with enabling, and family commitment with self-denial. By the end of August, I had made several significant changes in my daily routine and mindset. I joined a book club that met weekly at the local library. I signed up for a watercolor painting class that met twice a week at the senior center. I began volunteering at the animal shelter every Tuesday, helping to socialize rescue dogs and assisting with adoption events. I started taking daily walks with a neighbor named Helen, who had been trying to befriend me for years while I was too busy with family obligations to notice her efforts. These new activities brought me into contact with women who were facing similar challenges in their relationships with adult children. I learned that my experience of being taken for granted by the people I loved most was far from unique. Many of the women I met had struggled with finding the balance between being supportive mothers and maintaining their own identities and interests. Margaret, one of the women in my book club, had gone through a similar experience with her son and daughter-in-law, who had expected her to provide constant childcare and financial support, while excluding her from important family decisions. She had eventually established boundaries that allowed her to maintain a loving relationship with her family while preserving her own well-being and autonomy. The hardest thing, Margaret told me during one of our conversations, was accepting that loving someone doesn't mean sacrificing everything for them. I had to learn that I could be a good mother without being a martyred mother. Her words resonated deeply with me and helped me understand that my recent changes in behavior weren't selfish or uncaring, but rather a necessary step toward building healthier family relationships. By developing my own interests and establishing my own boundaries, I was modeling for my children what it looked like to be a whole, independent person, rather than someone whose entire identity was defined by their relationships with others. As September approached, I felt stronger and more confident than I had in years. My new activities had given me a sense of purpose that wasn't dependent on other people's approval or appreciation. My friendships with Helen, Margaret, and the other women I had met were based on mutual respect and shared interests rather than one-sided giving and taking. For the first time in decades, I was living for myself while still maintaining love and concern for my family. It was during this period of personal growth and renewed independence that my body began sending me signals that something was seriously wrong. The chest pain started as a mild discomfort that I initially attributed to stress or overexertion from my new exercise routine. The shortness of breath seemed like a normal part of aging, or perhaps a side effect of being more active than I had been in years. The fatigue felt like a natural response to my busy schedule of volunteer work and social activities. I had always been the type of person who ignored minor health complaints, preferring to push through discomfort rather than complain or seek attention. During my nursing career, I had seen too many people who dramatized every ache and pain, and I was determined not to become one of those patients who ran to the doctor for every minor symptom. My medical training had taught me to distinguish between serious concerns and temporary problems, and I convinced myself that what I was experiencing fell into the latter category. The morning of September 15th changed everything. I woke up with crushing chest pain that radiated down my left arm and made it difficult to breathe. Even with my medical background, it took me several minutes to acknowledge that I was likely having a heart attack. The pain was unlike anything I had ever experienced, a crushing weight that made every breath a struggle and every movement an enormous effort. I managed to call 911, though speaking was difficult, and I wasn't sure the dispatcher could understand my gasps and whispered words. While I waited for the ambulance, I tried to call Thomas, Jennifer, and Amy, wanting them to know what was happening and needing the comfort of hearing their voices. Thomas's phone went straight to voicemail. Jennifer didn't answer, though I knew she was working and probably couldn't take personal calls. Amy's phone rang several times before going to voicemail as well. By the time the paramedics arrived, I was barely conscious. The next few hours were a blur of sirens, medical equipment, urgent voices, and the overwhelming fear that I might be dying alone. The emergency room staff at Riverside General, where I had worked for 4 decades, recognized me immediately and provided exceptional care, but their professional compassion couldn't replace the family support I desperately wanted. The cardiac catheterization revealed significant blockages in 2 major arteries, requiring immediate surgical intervention. The cardiologist explained that I would need emergency bypass surgery and that the next few hours would be critical for my survival. As they prepared me for surgery, I kept asking if my children had been contacted, if anyone was coming to be with me, if I would see familiar faces when I woke up. The last thing I remembered before the anesthesia took effect was asking the nurse to make sure my children knew how much I loved them, just in case I didn't survive the surgery. I wanted them to understand that despite our recent distance, despite my hurt feelings about their behavior, they were still the most important people in my life, and I would forgive anything if I could just see them again. When I woke up in the cardiac intensive care unit 18 hours later, the first thing I did was look around the room for my children. The space was sterile and quiet, filled with beeping monitors and medical equipment, but empty of the people I most wanted to see. A nurse named Patricia, whom I had trained years earlier, was checking my vital signs and adjusting my medications. "Did my children come?" I asked, my voice hoarse from the breathing tube that had been removed earlier. Patricia's expression was carefully neutral, the kind of professional mask nurses learn to wear when delivering difficult news. "Your son Thomas called yesterday evening asking about your condition. I gave him the update you authorized about your surgery going well. Your daughters haven't called yet, but I'm sure they'll be in touch soon." The crushing disappointment I felt was worse than the physical pain from my surgical incisions. Thomas had called but hadn't come. Jennifer and Amy hadn't even bothered to call. I had undergone major heart surgery, could have died on the operating table, and my children couldn't be bothered to visit or even check on my condition personally. Over the next 3 days, the pattern of neglect became impossible to ignore or rationalize away. Thomas called once more, a brief conversation where he asked if I needed anything and seemed relieved when I told him the hospital was taking good care of me. Jennifer sent a text message saying she hoped I was feeling better and would try to visit when her schedule allowed. Amy did nothing at all, as if my medical emergency had never happened. I spent those 3 days alone in my hospital room, watching other patients receive visitors, flowers, balloons, and expressions of love and concern from their families. My room remained bare and quiet, a stark contrast to the celebration of life and recovery happening in rooms around me. The nurses, many of whom had worked with me for years, tried to provide extra attention and comfort, but their professional kindness only emphasized the absence of personal love and support. On the afternoon of my 3rd day in the hospital, I overheard a conversation that changed everything. Thomas was speaking to someone on the phone outside my room, his voice carrying through the thin walls in a way that made his words impossible to ignore. "She's fine," he was saying dismissively. "The surgery went well and she'll be home in a few days. Patricia and I can't get away right now with the boys' school starting and everything we have going on. Besides, she's been so weird and distant lately, barely talking to any of us. Maybe this will make her realize she needs us more than she thought." The casual cruelty of his words took my breath away more effectively than any heart attack ever could. He wasn't absent because of circumstances beyond his control. He was absent by choice, because visiting his mother in the hospital after major surgery was inconvenient for his schedule. More devastating was his suggestion that my medical emergency might teach me a lesson about appreciating my family, as if I were a child being punished for bad behavior, rather than a mother who had devoted her entire life to her children's well-being. That evening, after Thomas left without even entering my room, I asked Patricia the nurse to bring me paper and a pen. It was time to make some changes that would reflect the reality of my relationships with my children, rather than the fantasy one had been maintaining for years. I spent 2 hours writing a new will that would distribute my $2 million estate to the people and organizations that had actually shown care and concern for my well-being. The animal shelter where I volunteered would receive $500,000 to build a new facility and expand their rescue programs. The literacy center would get $300,000 to fund programs for adult learners. Helen, my walking companion who had visited me every day in the hospital, would receive my house and enough money to maintain it. Margaret, from my book club, who had brought me flowers and homemade soup, would inherit my cabin at the lake. The remainder of my estate would be divided among various charities that supported causes I cared about: medical research, education, and programs for elderly people who didn't have family support. Every organization and individual who would benefit from my will had demonstrated genuine care for my well-being without expecting anything in return. My 3 children, who had collectively abandoned me during the most frightening experience of my life, would receive nothing. Not because I wanted to hurt them, but because they had already demonstrated that they didn't value or appreciate what I had to offer. They had made it clear through their actions that my presence in their lives was optional and conditional, valued only when it provided them with some tangible benefit. As I signed the document that would determine how my life's work would be distributed after my death, I felt a sense of peace and empowerment that I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in decades, I was making a decision based on my own values and experiences, rather than on my children's expectations or demands. I was choosing to support people and causes that had earned my respect and gratitude, rather than people who assumed they deserved my generosity simply because we shared genetic material. The next morning, when the social worker came to discuss my discharge plans, I told her I would be going home alone and didn't need family assistance with my recovery. I had already arranged for a home health nurse to check on me daily and had hired a service to help with cleaning and cooking until I regained my strength. I had learned that I was perfectly capable of taking care of myself, and that I preferred solitude to the company of people who saw me as a burden or an obligation. When I was finally released from the hospital a week after my surgery, I returned to a house that felt different than the one I had left. It was still the same building with the same furniture and decorations, but it no longer felt like a shrine to my children's lives and achievements. Instead, it felt like my home, a place where I could focus on my own recovery and continue building the independent life I had started creating before my heart attack. The weeks that followed my surgery were a period of profound healing, both physical and emotional. My body slowly recovered from the trauma of surgery, growing stronger each day as I followed my doctor's instructions for gradual increases in activity and careful attention to my diet and medications. But more importantly, my spirit began to heal from years of emotional neglect and disappointment. Helen proved to be an invaluable friend during my recovery, stopping by daily to check on my progress and bringing meals that were both delicious and heart-healthy. Margaret visited several times each week, often bringing books from our book club for me to read during my periods of rest. The women from my painting class sent flowers and cards, and several of them took turns visiting to keep me company during the long afternoons when I wasn't supposed to exert myself. The contrast between the support I received from my new friends and the continued silence from my children was stark and illuminating. These women, whom I had known for only a few months, were providing the kind of care and concern that my own children couldn't be bothered to offer. They asked detailed questions about my recovery, listened to my fears and concerns about my health, and celebrated small milestones in my healing process with genuine enthusiasm and relief. Thomas finally called 3 weeks after my discharge, ostensibly to check on my recovery, but actually to ask if I could babysit the twins for an upcoming weekend, when he and Patricia wanted to attend a wedding. When I told him I wasn't cleared for that level of activity yet, he seemed annoyed rather than concerned about my ongoing health limitations. "How much longer until you're back to normal?" he asked, as if my recovery timeline was primarily important because of how it affected his childcare arrangements. "The doctor says it will be several more months before I'm completely healed," I replied, testing whether he would express any sympathy or concern for what I was going through. "Well, let me know when you're ready to help out again," he said, ending the conversation without asking any questions about my pain levels, my emotional state, or my overall well-being. Jennifer's first contact came a month after my surgery, in the form of a text message asking if I could contribute money toward Sophie's school fundraiser. There was no inquiry about my health, no expression of concern about my recovery, just a financial request delivered through the most impersonal medium possible. When I didn't respond immediately, she sent a follow-up message asking if I had seen her text and needed her to call with more details about the fundraiser. Amy's silence continued for 6 weeks after my surgery before she finally called, but only because she needed advice about her son Jacob's college applications. During our conversation, she mentioned my heart attack almost as an afterthought, saying she hoped I was feeling better before launching into a detailed discussion of her concerns about college tuition costs and application deadlines. When I tried to share some of my experiences during recovery, she seemed impatient and distracted, clearly more interested in receiving help with her problems than in offering support for mine. The pattern that had emerged before my surgery continued and intensified afterward. My children contacted me only when they needed something, showed no genuine interest in my well-being or recovery, and seemed to view my ongoing health limitations as inconveniences that affected their access to my resources. Their behavior during my medical crisis had revealed the true nature of our relationships in a way that could no longer be ignored or rationalized away. During my follow-up appointments with the cardiologist, I found myself discussing not just my physical recovery, but also the emotional impact of my family's abandonment. Dr. Rodriguez, who had performed my surgery, was both a skilled physician and a compassionate man who understood that healing involved more than just repairing damaged arteries. Social support is crucial for cardiac recovery, he told me during one appointment. Patients who have strong family relationships generally heal faster and have better long-term outcomes. But, he added carefully, sometimes family relationships can be a source of stress rather than support, and in those cases, patients often do better when they create new support systems with people who genuinely care about their well-being. His words gave me permission to acknowledge what I had been feeling, but hadn't wanted to admit, that my children's behavior was actually harmful to my recovery, rather than simply disappointing. Their continued demands for money and services, combined with their complete lack of concern for my health and emotional needs, was creating stress that could potentially affect my healing process and long-term cardiac health. I made the decision to stop trying to maintain relationships that were clearly damaging to my well-being. When my children called asking for money or favors, I politely declined, explaining that I was focusing on my recovery and couldn't take on additional responsibilities. When they expressed frustration or anger about my unavailability, I calmly explained that my health had to be my priority and that I needed to conserve my energy for healing. The reaction from my children was swift and revealing. Thomas accused me of being selfish and using my health problems as an excuse to avoid family responsibilities. Jennifer suggested that I was being overly dramatic about my recovery and that plenty of people returned to their normal activities much sooner after heart surgery. Amy implied that I was punishing them for not being available during my hospitalization, as if their abandonment had been a minor oversight rather than a deliberate choice. Their responses confirmed what I had already begun to understand. They viewed me not as a person deserving of love and respect, but as a resource that existed to serve their needs. My value to them was entirely functional, based on what I could provide rather than who I was as a human being. When I was no longer able or willing to fulfill that function, they saw me as defective, rather than as someone who deserved care and support during a difficult time. 3 months after my surgery, I met with my attorney to finalize the changes to my will. The document I had drafted in the hospital had been refined and legally perfected, ensuring that my estate would be distributed according to my true values and relationships rather than according to societal expectations about family obligations. As I signed the final version of my new will, I thought about the legacy I wanted to leave behind. Instead of enriching children who had shown me that they didn't value or appreciate my presence in their lives, my money would support causes and people who had demonstrated genuine care and kindness. The animal shelter would be able to save more lives. The literacy center would help more adults learn to read. Helen would have a beautiful home where she could age comfortably. Margaret would have a peaceful retreat where she could continue to heal from her own family disappointments. Most importantly, my new will reflected the person I had become rather than the person I used to be. The woman who had signed this document was someone who valued herself enough to demand reciprocal relationships, who was strong enough to set boundaries with people who mistreated her, and who was wise enough to invest her resources in people and causes that aligned with her values. 6 months after my surgery, I received an unexpected phone call from Thomas. His voice was unusually formal and cautious, as he asked if he could come over to discuss some family matters. Something in his tone suggested that this wasn't going to be a typical request for money or babysitting, and I agreed to meet with him the following afternoon. When Thomas arrived at my house, he was accompanied by Jennifer and Amy, which immediately put me on alert. My children hadn't all been in the same room together since Christmas, and they certainly hadn't coordinated a visit to see me without advance notice. Something was happening, and their collective presence felt more like an intervention than a family reunion. They arranged themselves on my living room furniture with an uncomfortable formality that reminded me of a business meeting. Thomas sat in the wingback chair that had been my late husband's favorite spot, while Jennifer and Amy positioned themselves on opposite ends of the sofa. Their body language was tense and defensive, as if they were preparing for a confrontation rather than a casual family visit. "Mom, we need to talk," Thomas began, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he used at the car dealership when negotiating with difficult customers. "We've been discussing some concerns about your behavior since your surgery, and we think it's time to address them directly." The word concerns immediately raised my defenses. After 6 months of taking care of my own recovery, with minimal support from any of them, they were now concerned about my behavior. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so insulting. "What kind of concerns?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral while internally preparing for whatever accusations they were about to level against me. Jennifer leaned forward, adopting the clinical tone she used with difficult patients at the hospital. "We've noticed that you've become very withdrawn from the family. You're not available to help with the grandchildren anymore. You've stopped hosting Sunday dinners, and you seem to have replaced us with strangers." The phrase "replaced us with strangers" was particularly galling, considering that the strangers she was referring to were the people who had actually provided support and companionship during my recovery, while my own children were nowhere to be found. "You mean my friends," I corrected calmly. "Helen, Margaret, and the other women I've met through my volunteer work and activities. They're not strangers, they're people who care about my well-being." Amy shifted uncomfortably on the sofa before speaking. "That's exactly what we're talking about, Mom. You're prioritizing these new relationships over your own family. Jacob asked me last week why Grandma Maggie doesn't want to see him anymore, and I didn't know what to tell him." The manipulation in her words was so transparent that I felt a surge of anger mixed with disappointment. She was using my grandson's supposed confusion to make me feel guilty for establishing boundaries and taking care of my health. The fact that she had apparently told Jacob that I didn't want to see him, rather than explaining that I was recovering from major surgery, revealed exactly how she viewed my situation. "Did you explain to Jacob that I had heart surgery and needed time to heal?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from her expression. "Well, that was months ago," Jennifer interjected impatiently. "You're fine now. Dr. Martinez cleared you for normal activities at your last appointment. There's no reason you can't resume your responsibilities to the family." The word responsibilities hung in the air like an accusation. Not relationships or connections or time together, but responsibilities. They saw my role in their lives as a series of obligations rather than opportunities for mutual love and support. "What responsibilities are those exactly?" I asked, genuinely curious to hear how they defined my role in their lives. Thomas took the lead, apparently having been designated as the primary spokesperson for this intervention. "Babysitting when we need you, helping with expenses for the kids' activities, being available when we have emergencies or problems. You know, the things grandmothers do for their families." "The things grandmothers do," I repeated slowly, testing the words in my mouth. "Are those the same things families do for grandmothers? Like visiting when they're in the hospital, or checking on them during recovery, or showing interest in their well-being?" The silence that followed my question was deafening. None of them had an answer because they had never considered that relationships might involve reciprocal obligations. In their minds, family love flowed in only one direction, from me to them. "That's different," Amy finally said, though she couldn't quite explain how it was different. "You raised us to be independent. You taught us to handle our own problems." "I also raised you to be compassionate," I replied, "to care about other people's feelings and needs, to show up for the people you love when they're going through difficult times." Jennifer's professional mask slipped for a moment, revealing genuine frustration underneath. "Look, Mom, we're busy. We all have jobs and responsibilities and our own families to worry about. We can't drop everything every time you have a health issue." "I had major heart surgery," I said quietly. "I could have died on the operating table. That wasn't a minor health issue or an inconvenience. That was a life-threatening emergency, and none of you could be bothered to even visit me in the hospital." "We called," Thomas protested weakly. "You called once to ask if I needed anything, and then seemed relieved when I said the hospital was taking care of me. That's not the same thing as being present for someone you supposedly love." The conversation continued for another hour, with my children alternating between guilt trips, accusations, and demands for me to return to my previous role as the family's unpaid babysitter and financial resource. They seemed genuinely puzzled by my refusal to resume providing services they had clearly taken for granted for years. What struck me most about the entire interaction was their complete inability to understand my perspective or acknowledge their own behavior. They saw my withdrawal from family obligations as unreasonable and selfish, but they couldn't recognize that their treatment of me during my medical crisis had been cruel and abandoning. They wanted me to continue giving without offering anything meaningful in return. As they prepared to leave, clearly frustrated by their inability to manipulate me back into compliance, Thomas delivered what he apparently thought was a final, decisive argument. "You know, Mom, family is supposed to be there for each other. If you keep pushing us away, you're going to end up alone and bitter, with no one to take care of you when you get older." The threat was barely veiled. "Continue serving our needs, or we'll abandon you completely when you need us most." The irony was that they had already abandoned me when I needed them most, and I had discovered that I was perfectly capable of taking care of myself and building meaningful relationships with people who actually cared about me. "I'm not pushing you away," I replied calmly. "I'm simply not available to be taken advantage of anymore. If you want a relationship with me, it needs to be based on mutual respect and genuine affection, not on what I can do for you." After they left, I sat in my living room feeling surprisingly calm and clear-headed. The confrontation I had been dreading for months was over, and it had confirmed everything I had already concluded about my relationships with my children. They saw me as a resource to be accessed rather than a person to be loved. They felt entitled to my time, money, and services without offering anything meaningful in return. More importantly, their visit had solidified my resolve about the changes I had made to my will. These were not people who deserved to inherit the fruits of my lifetime of work and sacrifice. They had already demonstrated that they would take whatever I gave them without gratitude, appreciation, or reciprocal care. The next few weeks brought a campaign of manipulation that was both predictable and pathetic. Jennifer called several times, alternating between anger and artificial sweetness, as she tried different approaches to get me to resume my previous level of family involvement. She complained about the cost of childcare now that I wasn't available to babysit, suggested that I was being selfish by prioritizing my own activities over family needs, and even attempted to make me feel guilty about Sophie's supposed disappointment at not seeing me more often. Amy took a different approach, focusing on emotional manipulation and manufactured crises. She called crying about Jacob's struggles with his college applications, implying that my lack of involvement was somehow contributing to his stress. She mentioned financial pressures related to his education, clearly hoping I would offer to help pay for his college expenses. When I didn't take the bait, she became more direct, asking outright if I could contribute money toward his tuition. Thomas was the most aggressive in his attempts to restore the previous dynamic. He showed up at my house unannounced several times, sometimes with the twins in tow, clearly hoping that seeing my grandsons would break down my resistance. When I maintained my boundaries and declined to provide babysitting services, he became openly hostile, accusing me of punishing innocent children for adult disagreements. "Michael and Matthew don't understand why Maggie doesn't want to spend time with them anymore," he said during one particularly manipulative visit. "They think they did something wrong." "Then perhaps you should explain to them that Grandma Maggie is recovering from major surgery and needs to take care of her health," I suggested. "Unless you've told them something else." His uncomfortable silence confirmed that he had indeed told them something else, probably that I was being difficult or unreasonable, rather than acknowledging the medical reality of my situation. The pressure campaign continued for nearly 2 months, with various combinations of guilt trips, emotional manipulation, and veiled threats. My children seemed to believe that if they just found the right approach, they could convince me to return to my previous role as their personal support system. They couldn't accept that I had fundamentally changed my understanding of what family relationships should look like. During this period, I found immense comfort and support in my friendships with Helen, Margaret, and the other women I had met through my volunteer activities. They had watched my children's behavior during my recovery with a mixture of shock and recognition, having experienced similar situations with their own families. "You're not the first woman to discover that her children see her as a convenience rather than a person," Margaret told me during one of our weekly coffee dates. "The difference is that you're strong enough to do something about it instead of just accepting it." Helen, who had become my closest friend, was more direct in her assessment. "They're vultures," she said bluntly. "They stayed away while you were sick because sick people require care and attention. Now they're circling back because they want to make sure their inheritance is still secure." Her words were harsh but accurate. My children had shown no genuine concern for my well-being during my medical crisis, but they were suddenly very concerned about my behavior once they realized it might affect their access to my resources. I decided to test Helen's theory by having a casual conversation with each of my children about my plans for my estate. I didn't reveal the changes I had already made, but I mentioned that my recent health scare had made me think about how I wanted my assets distributed after my death. The reactions were immediate and revealing. Thomas became suddenly attentive and solicitous, calling more frequently and offering to help with household projects I hadn't asked for assistance with. Jennifer started dropping by with takeout dinners and magazines, claiming she was concerned about my nutrition and entertainment during my recovery. Amy began sending frequent text messages with photos of Jacob and updates about his activities, clearly attempting to remind me of my emotional connection to my grandson. None of them addressed the fundamental issues in our relationships or acknowledged their behavior during my hospitalization. Instead, they simply increased their efforts to maintain their access to my resources while continuing to offer nothing meaningful in return. The transparency of their motives was both hurtful and liberating. It confirmed that my decision to change my will had been based on accurate perceptions of their priorities and values. They were concerned about my money, not my well-being. They wanted to preserve their inheritance, not rebuild our relationships. As winter approached, marking nearly a year since my heart surgery, I realized that I had created a life that was fuller and more satisfying than anything I had experienced in decades. My volunteer work at the animal shelter had expanded into a leadership role, helping to organize fundraising events and coordinate adoption programs. My painting classes had evolved into a genuine hobby that brought me joy and creative fulfillment. My friendships with Helen, Margaret, and others provided the emotional support and companionship that I had been seeking from my children for years. Most importantly, I had learned to value myself enough to demand reciprocal relationships. I no longer accepted being treated as a resource to be accessed only when convenient. I expected the people in my life to show genuine interest in my well-being, to offer support during difficult times, and to contribute to the relationship rather than simply taking from it. The contrast between my new life and my previous existence was striking. Where I had once felt constantly anxious about my children's approval and availability, I now felt confident and independent. Where I had once sacrificed my own interests to accommodate their needs, I now pursued activities that brought me personal satisfaction. Where I had once felt guilty for wanting attention and appreciation, I now surrounded myself with people who freely offered both. My health had also improved dramatically once I eliminated the stress of managing my children's emotions and expectations. My blood pressure stabilized, my sleep quality improved, and my energy levels increased. Dr. Rodriguez noted the positive changes during my regular checkups and attributed them partly to my improved stress management and social support system. "Whatever changes you've made in your life are clearly working," he told me during one appointment. "Your cardiac markers are excellent, and you seem much more relaxed and positive than you were in the months immediately following your surgery." I didn't tell him about the specific changes I had made in my family relationships, but I acknowledged that I had eliminated several sources of stress from my daily life and focused on activities and relationships that brought me joy rather than anxiety. The holidays that year presented an interesting test of my new boundaries. Instead of spending weeks planning and preparing elaborate celebrations for my children and grandchildren, I made plans that centered on my own preferences and the people who had actually shown care and support for me. Helen and I organized a Thanksgiving dinner for the women from our book club and painting class, many of whom were also dealing with complicated family relationships. We prepared a meal together, shared stories about what we were grateful for, and celebrated the friendships that had developed over the past year. The conversation was lively and genuine, filled with laughter and mutual support, rather than the tension and obligation that had characterized my family gatherings for years. Christmas was even more liberating. Instead of decorating my entire house and hosting an elaborate celebration for people who had shown no appreciation for my efforts, I traveled to Florida to spend the holiday with my sister Rose. We had a relaxing week of beach walks, casual meals, and long conversations about our lives and relationships. "You look 10 years younger," Rose told me as we sat on her patio watching the sunset over the Gulf of Mexico. "Whatever you've been doing this year has been good for you." I told her about the changes I had made in my life, the new friendships I had developed, and the boundaries I had established with my children. She listened with interest and approval. occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. "I'm proud of you," she said when I finished. "It takes courage to change patterns that have been in place for decades, especially when those patterns involve your own children. But you've done what needed to be done to protect your own well-being." While I was in Florida, I received several angry voice messages from my children about my absence during the holidays. They had apparently expected me to host Christmas dinner as usual, despite the fact that none of them had offered to help with preparations or even asked about my plans. My absence had forced them to make alternative arrangements, which they clearly resented. Thomas left a particularly nasty message accusing me of being selfish and vindictive, claiming that I was ruining Christmas for the grandchildren by refusing to participate in family traditions. Jennifer's message was more manipulative, expressing hurt and confusion about my behavior and wondering what she had done to deserve being excluded from my holiday plans. Amy's message was brief but pointed, simply saying that she hoped I was happy with my decision to abandon my family during the most important holiday of the year. None of them seemed to recognize the irony of their complaints. They were angry about being abandoned during the holidays by someone they had abandoned during a medical emergency. They felt entitled to my presence and participation, while offering nothing meaningful in return. I didn't return their calls immediately, instead enjoying the peace and beauty of my sister's home while considering how to respond. Eventually, I sent each of them a brief text message, explaining that I had made holiday plans that suited my current needs and preferences, and that I hoped they had enjoyed their celebrations with their immediate families. The responses were swift and angry. All three of them called within hours of receiving my message, demanding explanations for my behavior and threatening various consequences if I didn't return to my previous level of family involvement. The threats ranged from cutting off my access to the grandchildren to excluding me from future family events, all of which struck me as empty since they had already demonstrated that my presence wasn't particularly valued or appreciated. When I returned home from Florida in early January, I found my mailbox stuffed with cards and letters that had been delivered during my absence. Most were holiday greetings from my new friends and the organizations where I volunteered, expressing appreciation for my contributions and wishing me well in the new year. The warmth and genuine affection in these messages contrasted sharply with the anger and manipulation I had received from my own children. There was also a letter from my attorney, informing me that the final version of my revised will had been properly filed, and that all legal requirements had been met. Reading his confirmation that my assets would be distributed according to my true relationships and values gave me a sense of satisfaction and completion that I hadn't expected. I spent the first few weeks of the new year reflecting on the dramatic changes that had occurred in my life over the past 18 months. The heart attack that could have killed me had instead revealed truths about my relationships that might have remained hidden for years if I had continued in my previous patterns of self-sacrifice and people-pleasing. My children had shown me exactly how they viewed our relationships when they thought I might die, and that revelation had freed me to create a life based on mutual respect and genuine care rather than one-sided obligation and manipulation. The people who had earned places in my revised will were those who had demonstrated real concern for my well-being without expecting anything in return. The animal shelter staff had sent flowers to the hospital and called regularly to check on my recovery. Margaret had brought homemade soup and offered to help with household tasks during my convalescence. Helen had rearranged her own schedule to provide daily companionship and support. These people had shown me what genuine care looked like, and they had earned my gratitude and generosity in ways that my children never had. As spring approached, marking the one-year anniversary of my decision to step back from my role as the family's primary support system, I realized that I had no regrets about the choices I had made. My life was smaller in some ways, with fewer people making demands on my time and resources, but it was richer in meaningful connections and personal satisfaction. I had learned that love should be reciprocal, that families should provide mutual support rather than one-way service, and that I deserved to be treated with the same respect and consideration that I had always shown others. Most importantly, I had discovered that it was never too late to change patterns that weren't working, even when those patterns involved the most fundamental relationships in my life. The woman who had signed that revised will in her hospital bed was someone I barely recognized from the person I had been just 2 years earlier. She was stronger, more independent, more selective about how she invested her emotional energy, and more protective of her own well-being. She had learned to value herself enough to demand better treatment from the people in her life. and she had found the courage to walk away when that better treatment wasn't forthcoming. My children continued their intermittent attempts to restore the previous dynamic, but their efforts became less frequent and less aggressive, as they gradually accepted that I wasn't going to return to my role as their personal support system. They seemed to be learning to manage their own childcare needs and financial challenges, which was probably a healthier arrangement for everyone involved. Occasionally, one of them would make what appeared to be a genuine effort to rebuild our relationship on more equal terms. Jennifer called once to ask about my health and volunteer activities, without requesting any favors or assistance. Amy sent a card on my birthday that included a heartfelt note about missing our relationship and wanting to understand how to repair it. These overtures were encouraging, but they were also infrequent and inconsistent. More often, the contact I received from my children was still focused on what I could do for them, rather than on building genuine connections. Thomas still called primarily when he needed babysitting help. Jennifer still reached out mostly when she wanted financial contributions to Sophie's activities. Amy still contacted me mainly when she was dealing with problems that she thought I could solve. I responded to all of their communications politely, but maintained the boundaries I had established. I was willing to have relationships with my children, but only if those relationships were based on mutual respect and genuine care, rather than on my willingness to provide unlimited services and resources. The process of rebuilding trust and connection would take time, and it would require them to demonstrate sustained changes in their behavior rather than occasional gestures of interest. I had learned that actions speak louder than words, and that patterns of behavior are more revealing than isolated incidents of kindness or concern. As I sat in my garden on a warm spring afternoon, watching the flowers I had planted during my recovery bloom into vibrant displays of color, I thought about the growth that had occurred in my own life over the past year. Like the plants around me, I had needed time, proper care, and the right conditions to flourish. Removing the stress and negativity from my daily life had allowed me to bloom in ways I hadn't thought possible at my age. The future stretched ahead of me with possibilities I was only beginning to explore. I was considering taking a cruise to Alaska with Helen, something I had always dreamed of doing but had never pursued because I was too busy managing family obligations. Margaret had suggested we take a painting workshop in Tuscany, combining our love of art with travel to one of the world's most beautiful destinations. I was also exploring opportunities to expand my volunteer work, possibly joining the board of directors at the animal shelter, or helping to establish a new literacy program in my community. For the first time in decades, I was making plans based on my own interests and passions rather than on other people's needs and expectations. The revised will that lay securely filed in my attorney's office represented more than just a different distribution of my assets. It represented a fundamental shift in how I valued relationships and defined family. Blood relations that weren't nurtured with love and respect were less meaningful than chosen connections built on mutual care and support. Helen, Margaret, and the other people who would benefit from my estate had earned their places through consistent kindness, genuine concern, and reciprocal friendship. They had shown me what healthy relationships looked like, and they had helped me understand that I deserved to be treated with the same consideration and affection that I had always offered others. My children still had the opportunity to rebuild their relationships with me, but it would require them to approach me as a person worthy of respect, rather than as a resource to be exploited. They would need to show genuine interest in my well-being, offer support during difficult times, and contribute to our relationships rather than simply taking from them. Whether they would choose to make those changes remained to be seen. But regardless of their decisions, I had already created a life that was fulfilling and meaningful. I had learned to value myself enough to demand reciprocal relationships, and I had surrounded myself with people who freely offered the care and companionship I had been seeking for years. The heart attack that could have ended my life had instead given me a new beginning. It had forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about my relationships and make difficult decisions about how I wanted to spend my remaining years. The woman who emerged from that hospital room was stronger, wiser, and more independent than the one who had entered it. As the sun set over my garden, casting golden light across the flowers I had planted with my own hands, I felt a deep sense of peace and satisfaction. I had created something beautiful from a period of crisis and pain. I had learned to bloom where I was planted, even when the soil had initially seemed hostile and unwelcoming. The future was full of possibilities, and for the first time in years, those possibilities were entirely my own to explore. 2 years had passed since that transformative heart surgery, and the life I had built from the ashes of my old relationships continued to flourish in ways I had never imagined possible. The morning sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows of my home as I prepared breakfast for Helen, who had stayed overnight after we returned from our cruise to Norway. The trip had been everything I had dreamed it would be, filled with breathtaking fjords, charming coastal towns, and the easy companionship of someone who genuinely enjoyed my company. The photographs from our adventure were spread across my kitchen table, capturing moments of pure joy that I hadn't experienced in decades. There was Helen and me standing at the rail of the ship as we sailed through the Geirangerfjord, both of us bundled in warm coats and grinning like schoolgirls on their first adventure. Another showed us laughing over dinner in Bergen, toasting our friendship with glasses of local wine, while the midnight sun painted the sky in impossible shades of gold and pink. These images told the story of a woman who had learned to prioritize her own happiness without guilt or apology. The face looking back at me from those photographs was relaxed and radiant, free from the constant worry and stress that had aged me prematurely during the years when I sacrificed everything for my children's comfort and convenience. Helen emerged from the guest bedroom looking refreshed and eager to share coffee and stories from our journey. At 73, she possessed an energy and enthusiasm for life that put people half her age to shame. Our friendship had deepened during the months of planning our trip together, and the shared experience of exploring new places had cemented a bond that felt more genuine and supportive than any relationship I had maintained with my own children. I keep thinking about that conversation we had with Eric, our tour guide, Helen said as she settled into her favorite chair at my kitchen table. When he told us about how Norwegians prioritize work-life balance and taking care of their elderly parents, I couldn't help but think about how different things are here. I poured her coffee and added the precise amount of cream she preferred, a small gesture that represented the attention we paid to each other's preferences and comfort. It made me realize that my children's behavior isn't just personally disappointing, I replied. It reflects broader cultural problems with how we view family obligations and respect for older people. Our conversation was interrupted by the ringing of my phone, which displayed Thomas's name on the caller ID. It had been 3 months since our last communication, and I hesitated before answering, wondering what crisis or need had prompted him to contact me after such a long silence. "Hello, Thomas," I said, keeping my voice neutral and polite. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something important," he said without preamble. His tone carried an urgency that immediately put me on alert. "Patricia and I are getting divorced, and I'm going to need some help with the boys while we sort everything out." The request was so typical of our interactions that I almost laughed. No inquiry about my health or well-being, no interest in how I had been spending my time, just an immediate demand for assistance during his personal crisis. The old Maggie would have dropped everything to help, would have rearranged her entire life to accommodate his needs during this difficult time. "I'm sorry to hear about your divorce," I said sincerely. "That must be very difficult for everyone involved, especially Michael and Matthew." "Yeah, it's been rough," Thomas acknowledged briefly before returning to his primary concern. "The thing is, Patricia is being completely unreasonable about the custody arrangements, and I need someone reliable to watch the boys when I have them. You know how much they love staying at your house." Helen raised her eyebrows at Thomas's presumptuous tone, and I found myself seeing the conversation through her eyes. Here was my son, calling after months of no contact, to request significant childcare assistance without even pretending to care about my availability or willingness to help. "When would you need this help?" I asked, though I already knew my answer. "Starting next week, actually. The temporary custody order gives me every other weekend and 2 evenings during the week. I know it's short notice, but you're the only person I trust with the boys." The manipulation in his words was transparent. He didn't trust me more than other potential caregivers. I was simply the cheapest and most convenient option. Any professional childcare provider would require advance notice, clear scheduling, and financial compensation for their services. "Thomas, I appreciate that you're going through a difficult time," I said carefully. but I'm not available to provide regular childcare. I have my own commitments and activities that I'm not willing to rearrange." The silence that followed my refusal stretched uncomfortably long. When Thomas finally spoke, his voice carried a mixture of disbelief and anger that revealed exactly how he had expected this conversation to go. "Are you serious right now? These are your grandsons we're talking about. They need stability during this transition, and you're worried about your book club or whatever?" The dismissive way he referred to my activities as book club or whatever perfectly encapsulated his attitude toward my independent life. Nothing I did for myself could possibly be as important as what I could do for him and his children. "My commitments aren't trivial hobbies," I replied firmly. "They're meaningful activities with people who depend on me, just as you're asking me to do now. The difference is that these people appreciate my contributions and don't take my availability for granted." "This is unbelievable," Thomas said, his voice rising with frustration. "What happened to family loyalty? What happened to putting family first?" "Family loyalty should work both ways," I answered. "When I was in the hospital having heart surgery, where was your family loyalty? When I needed support during my recovery, where was your commitment to putting family first?" The question hung in the air between us, unanswered because we both knew there was no acceptable excuse for his absence during my medical crisis. His silence confirmed that he understood the hypocrisy of demanding family loyalty that he had never been willing to provide. "Look, I know I wasn't as available as I should have been when you were sick," he finally admitted, though his tone suggested that this acknowledgement was tactical rather than genuine. "But that doesn't mean you should punish innocent children for adult problems." "I'm not punishing anyone," I said calmly. "I'm simply living my life according to my own priorities and boundaries. If you need childcare assistance, there are professional services available. If you want a relationship with me, it needs to be based on mutual respect rather than one-sided demands for help." Thomas ended the call abruptly after making a few more unsuccessful attempts to guilt me into compliance. As I set my phone aside, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness for the relationship we could have had if he had been willing to treat me as a person rather than a resource, and relief that I no longer felt obligated to sacrifice my own well-being for his convenience. Helen reached across the table and squeezed my hand gently. "That couldn't have been easy," she said with understanding sympathy. "But you handled it perfectly. You were kind but firm, and you didn't let him manipulate you into abandoning your own needs." 2 years ago, I would have said yes immediately, I admitted. I would have canceled everything I had planned and rearranged my entire life to help him. And he would have taken that sacrifice for granted without ever considering what it cost me. "That's the difference between the old Maggie and the new one," Helen observed. "The old Maggie gave everything to people who didn't appreciate it. The new Maggie invests her time and energy in people and causes that value what she has to offer." Her words reminded me of the profound changes that had occurred in my life since I stopped trying to earn love through service and sacrifice. The people who surrounded me now wanted my company rather than my assistance, valued my opinions rather than my resources, and offered their own friendship rather than expecting one-sided generosity. Later that afternoon, I received a text message from Jennifer that was clearly coordinated with Thomas's phone call. The message expressed concern about my stubbornness and suggested that I was being unreasonable in refusing to help family members during times of crisis. She offered to meet for coffee to discuss what she called my changing priorities and their impact on family relationships. The language of her message was carefully chosen to make me appear selfish and unsympathetic while positioning my children as reasonable people trying to maintain family connections. The reality was that they wanted to restore the previous dynamic where I provided unlimited support while they offered nothing meaningful in return. I didn't respond to Jennifer's text immediately, instead spending time in my garden while considering how to address what was clearly a coordinated campaign to pressure me back into my old role. The flowers I had planted during my recovery were now mature and thriving, creating a landscape of beauty that I had created through my own efforts and attention. As I worked among the roses and delphiniums, I thought about the parallels between gardening and relationships. Both required consistent care, appropriate boundaries, and the wisdom to know when to nurture and when to prune. My children had become like invasive weeds, demanding all available resources, while contributing nothing to the overall health of the garden. The relationships I had cultivated with Helen, Margaret, and my other friends, were like the perennial flowers that returned year after year, bringing beauty and joy without requiring constant sacrifice or maintenance. These friendships flourished because they were based on mutual appreciation and shared interests rather than on obligation and exploitation. That evening, Margaret stopped by to return a book she had borrowed and to share news about a painting workshop she was organizing for our art group. As we sat on my back porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, I told her about the day's conversations with Thomas and Jennifer. "They're feeling the impact of your absence," Margaret observed wisely. "For years you made their lives easier by handling responsibilities they should have managed themselves. Now they're discovering how much work it actually takes to arrange childcare, manage family schedules, and deal with their own problems." "Part of me feels guilty," I admitted. "Michael and Matthew are innocent victims of their parents' divorce, and they don't deserve to suffer because I'm maintaining boundaries with their father." "But they're not your responsibility," Margaret reminded me gently. "You raised your children and helped them become independent adults. Their job now is to raise their own children and manage their own challenges. You've earned the right to live your own life." Her words helped clarify something I had been struggling with since Thomas's call. My guilt wasn't really about the grandchildren. It was about decades of conditioning that told me my value as a person was tied to my usefulness to others. Learning to separate my self-worth from my willingness to sacrifice had been one of the most difficult aspects of my transformation. "You know what struck me most about Thomas's call?" I said as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "He said he trusted me more than anyone else to care for his children, but he couldn't be bothered to visit me when I was recovering from life-threatening surgery. How can someone trust you with their most precious possessions while showing no concern for your well-being?" "Because trust in his mind means predictability," Margaret explained. "He trusts that you'll always say yes, always put his needs first, always be available when convenient. That's not the same thing as trusting your judgment or valuing your wisdom." The distinction was profound and painful. My children had never trusted me as a person worthy of respect and consideration. They had simply relied on my predictable willingness to subordinate my needs to theirs. True trust would have involved consulting me about major decisions, seeking my advice on important matters, and caring about my opinions and feelings. 3 days later, Amy called with what she presented as an emergency, but which revealed itself to be another attempt at emotional manipulation. Jacob had been rejected from his first-choice college, and she needed money to pay for applications to additional schools that might still accept late admissions. "I know you've been distant lately," Amy said, her voice thick with artificial tears. "But Jacob is devastated, and this is his future we're talking about. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't really important." The familiar pattern was immediately recognizable. Present a crisis involving one of the grandchildren, appeal to my emotions, minimize my previous concerns about their behavior, and request financial assistance. The old Maggie would have written a check immediately, grateful for the opportunity to prove her love and value to her family. "How much money are you talking about?" I asked, not because I intended to provide it, but because I was curious about the scope of their expectations. "Only about $3,000, Amy said quickly, as if the amount were insignificant. "It would cover application fees, transcript costs, and maybe a trip to visit a couple of schools that are still considering applicants." $3,000 was indeed a substantial amount, representing weeks of work for most people and requiring careful budgeting for families of modest means. The casual way Amy presented it revealed how accustomed she had become to viewing my money as a readily available resource for solving her problems. "Have you and Ryan applied for financial aid for Jacob's college expenses?" I asked, focusing on the practical aspects of their situation rather than the emotional manipulation. "Well, yes, but we don't qualify for much because of our income level," Amy admitted reluctantly. "And we've already borrowed as much as we can afford for his education." "Then perhaps Jacob needs to consider less expensive school options, or take a gap year to work and save money for college," I suggested. Many students face financial limitations when choosing their education path. The silence that followed my suggestion was filled with shock and disbelief. Amy had clearly expected me to solve their financial problem without question, just as I had solved countless other problems over the years. "I can't believe you're suggesting that Jacob settle for a lesser education because we can't afford what we want," Amy said, her voice rising with indignation. "You have more money than you could possibly spend, and you're going to let your grandson's future suffer over $3,000? The accusation stung because it was designed to make me feel selfish and uncaring, but I had learned to recognize guilt trips and emotional manipulation, and I refused to be controlled by tactics that had worked so effectively in the past. Jacob's education is important, I agreed. But it's not my responsibility to fund it. You and Ryan are his parents, and managing the costs of his education is part of your job as parents. Since when do you think it's not your job to help your family?" Amy demanded. "You've always been there for us before. What's changed?" "What's changed is that I learned the difference between helping and enabling," I replied. "I also learned that people who truly care about me show that care through their actions, not just their demands for assistance." Amy tried several more approaches during our conversation, alternating between anger, guilt, and pleading. She accused me of being vindictive, suggested that I was punishing her for past mistakes, and implied that my refusal to help would permanently damage Jacob's future prospects. None of her arguments moved me because I had learned to distinguish between genuine needs and manufactured crises. Jacob was a bright, capable young man who would find his way to a good education regardless of whether I funded his application process. My refusal to pay wasn't going to ruin his life. It was simply going to require his parents to take responsibility for their own financial decisions. After Amy hung up in frustration, I reflected on how differently I felt about these conversations compared to similar situations in the past. Where I once would have felt guilty and anxious about disappointing my children, I now felt calm and confident about my decisions. The boundaries I had established weren't meant to punish anyone. They were meant to protect my own well-being and encourage healthier family dynamics. Helen called that evening to check on me, having sensed during our morning coffee that I was dealing with family pressures. When I told her about the conversations with Thomas and Amy, she listened with the kind of attentive sympathy that I had been craving from my own children for years. "It sounds like they're testing your resolve," Helen observed. "They probably assumed that if they all pressured you at the same time, you'd cave in and return to your old patterns. The sad thing is that they're missing the opportunity to build genuine relationships with me," I said. If Thomas had called to share what he was going through and ask for emotional support, I would have been happy to listen and offer whatever wisdom I could. If Amy had talked to me about Jacob's disappointment and asked for advice rather than money, I would have been glad to help brainstorm solutions. But that would require them to see you as a person rather than a resource, Helen pointed out. And it would mean they'd have to reciprocate by offering you the same kind of emotional support. Her observation highlighted the fundamental problem with my relationships with my children. They had never learned to see me as a complete person with my own needs, feelings, and challenges. In their minds, I existed primarily to serve their needs, and they couldn't understand why I was no longer willing to fulfill that function. The following week brought an unexpected development that would test my resolve in ways I hadn't anticipated. Jennifer called to inform me that she had scheduled a family meeting for the upcoming Sunday, ostensibly to discuss, quote, family communication issues, but clearly intended as an intervention to pressure me back into compliance. "We all think it would be good to sit down together and work through some of the misunderstandings that have developed," Jennifer said in her most professional tone. "Thomas and Amy agree that we need to have an honest conversation about everyone's expectations and feelings." The language was carefully neutral, but the underlying message was clear. They had decided that my behavior was the problem, and they intended to use group pressure to force me to change. The fact that they had coordinated this meeting without consulting me about my availability or willingness to participate revealed exactly how they viewed my role in the family. "What kind of misunderstandings are you referring to?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Well, there seems to be some confusion about family responsibilities and how we support each other during difficult times," Jennifer replied diplomatically. "We think it would help to clarify everyone's expectations so we can move forward in a positive way." The euphemisms were almost comical in their transparency. Family responsibilities meant my willingness to provide unlimited services. Supporting each other meant my willingness to give without receiving. Clarifying expectations meant pressuring me to resume my previous role as the family's unpaid support system. "I don't think a family meeting is necessary," I said calmly. "My expectations are quite clear. I want relationships based on mutual respect and genuine care. I'm not available to provide unlimited services or financial support, but I'm always willing to have meaningful conversations and emotional connections. Mom, please don't make this harder than it has to be, Jennifer pleaded, her professional mask slipping to reveal genuine frustration underneath. We're trying to work things out as a family, and that requires everyone's participation. Working things out as a family would require acknowledging that I'm a person with my own needs and feelings, I replied. It would mean recognizing that relationships should involve give and take rather than one-sided demands for service. Jennifer made several more attempts to convince me to attend their intervention, but I remained firm in my refusal. The idea of sitting in a room while my 3 children took turns telling me how my behavior was selfish and unreasonable held no appeal whatsoever. I had already heard their arguments individually, and I knew that combining their voices wouldn't make their positions any more valid or compelling. That Sunday, while my children were presumably meeting to discuss my inadequacies as a mother and grandmother, I spent the day volunteering at the animal shelter's adoption fair. The event was held in the parking lot of a local pet store, with volunteers like me helping potential adopters meet rescue dogs and cats who needed homes. The contrast between my family's criticism and the gratitude I received from the shelter staff and the families who adopted pets couldn't have been more stark. Here were people who appreciated my contributions, valued my time and effort, and expressed genuine thanks for my involvement in their organization. Sarah, the shelter director, made a point of thanking me personally for my consistent volunteer work and the generous donation I had made the previous month. "We couldn't do this work without people like you," she said sincerely. "Your dedication to these animals makes a real difference in their lives." The appreciation in her voice was genuine and heartfelt, a sharp contrast to the entitled demands I received from my own children. The animals I helped care for were grateful for attention and kindness without expecting me to sacrifice my own well-being for their comfort. As I drove home that evening, feeling satisfied and fulfilled by a day well spent, I realized that I had found my true family among the people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. Blood relationships that weren't nurtured with love and respect had proven to be less meaningful than chosen connections built on mutual appreciation and shared values. The revised will that lay securely filed in my attorney's office represented more than just a different distribution of my assets. It represented a fundamental recognition that family is defined by behavior rather than biology, and that people earn their place in our lives through consistent kindness and genuine care. My children still had the opportunity to rebuild their relationships with me, but it would require them to approach me as a person worthy of respect rather than as a resource to be exploited. They would need to show genuine interest in my well-being, offer support during difficult times, and contribute to our relationships rather than simply taking from them. Whether they would choose to make those changes remained to be seen. But regardless of their decisions, I had already created a life that was fulfilling and meaningful. I had learned to value myself enough to demand reciprocal relationships, and I had surrounded myself with people who freely offered the care and companionship I had been seeking for years. The woman who had signed that revised will in her hospital bed had been reborn through crisis and pain into someone stronger, wiser, and more independent. She had learned that it's never too late to change course, never too late to demand better treatment, and never too late to choose happiness over obligation. As I settled into my comfortable chair that evening with a cup of tea and a good book, surrounded by photographs of recent adventures and mementos from meaningful friendships, I felt a deep sense of contentment and peace. I had created something beautiful from the ashes of disappointment and betrayal. I had learned to bloom where I was planted, even when the soil had initially seemed hostile and unwelcoming. The future stretched ahead of me with possibilities I was eager to explore, adventures I was excited to pursue, and relationships I was grateful to nurture. For the first time in decades, those possibilities were entirely my own to choose, and that freedom was worth more than any inheritance I could have left behind. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.